بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم اللهم افتح علينا فتوح العارفين ووافقنا توفيق الصالحين وانفعنا بالقرآن والذكر الحكيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah and jazakumullah khairan. Thank you, Sister Sanya, for inviting me for these series of talks. It's always great to have this opportunity, especially with other Muslim medics, to share some of things that I've learned over the years. There was one of the great scholars of the Salaf. He used to travel around a lot, and when he used to come to a town, if he came into a town and no one came to ask him any questions, he used to leave that town and say, "This is a town where knowledge is dead." So it's always good to have people that want to learn and share in knowledge, inshallah. So, all right. So, I'm currently working as a consultant psychiatrist full time. Um, I'm hoping to cut down my hours of work in the future to spend more time in teaching, inshallah, if opportunity comes up. But I've been working full time for the last few years anyway, but still carrying on my teaching part time at Harmeem College. And we're now currently about to launch a new initiative called London College of Islamic Studies. And that's why it says that on the screen under Harmeem Foundation. And we're hopefully going to be getting a few scholars together in the West London area to be able to teach people that want to learn all the way up to alim level. So the title today is Islam, Science and Medicine. These are the sort of areas or topics we'll look at today. And also we will talk a bit about prophetic medicine and Islamic medicine that some of you wanted me to go into a little bit as well. So we'll talk about what's called Islamic medicine and what's called prophetic or Tibb Nabawi, and what my understanding is of those things. And where we are as Muslims, and in terms of Islamic knowledge in relation to what we can call Western medicine, although it's now globalized, it's not really Western, but if I do say Western medicine, sometimes we can call it modern medicine or allopathic. All of those terms can be used for the type of scientific medicine that we practice nowadays. So going into the historical relation, a bit into the history of it, there's a really interesting history between Islam, Christianity, Greek philosophy, and science. Obviously, we don't have time to go in depth into all of that right now, but just briefly, what we can say is that the Muslims, early Muslim scholars, in the very early generations, under the early Abbasids especially, there was a massive translation of Greek philosophical and scientific works, as well as Indian and Chinese. So the Muslims, obviously, they were following the imperative in the Quran to seek knowledge and the guidance of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to seek knowledge. And under patronage of wealthy Muslims, such as the great Khalifa Harun Rashid, who set up the Baytul Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, and that led to the translation movement and the great intellectual flowering of the classical Islamic age. The Muslim scholars were they were very interested in the Greek philosophy, especially Aristotle was a particular favorite of the Muslims. Aristotle, his philosophy was characterized by being quite empirical, and scientific in his treatment of nature and the study of nature, categorization, and so on. And obviously, Aristotle developed formal logic, um, which the Muslims really liked as well. So the Muslims, they took on Greek philosophy, and um, the debate between the theologians and the philosophers went on for many, many centuries, and in some ways is still ongoing. So it's a long story. Um, but some of the main figures are people like Ibn Sina. After Ibn Sina, before Ibn Sina, you had Al-Farabi. After Ibn Sina, you had Al-Ghazali. And Al-Ghazali is really the sort of orthodox Sunni position. And he accepted, many of the aspects of philosophy that he thought were useful, and things like Aristotelian logic and so on. But he also rejected a lot of the Greek philosophy, which he felt was against the teachings of Islam. And he wrote a famous book called The Incoherence of Philosophers. And the story goes on. Anyway, it didn't end with Ghazali, but it went on, and the debate continued between the theologians and the philosophers, Muslim philosophers. The interesting thing about the Muslim philosophers, they always retained a belief in the one God, and they all retained a belief in the Quran. So great philosophers like Ibn Sina, for example, none of them were atheists. And that was a unique thing. And that was what I wanted to draw your attention to here, that when the Greek philosophy came to Europe, and it came to Europe in the Renaissance period of the, Renaissance leading on to the Enlightenment being in the 18th century. But it had already crept in, before that, during the Renaissance and so on. And it came from the Muslims. The Greek and Roman works came to Europe through the Muslims, through Arabic works. Um, but when the philosophy came to Europe through the Enlightenment, Christianity was not really able to sustain the work of the philosophers, and eventually Christianity really intellectually couldn't sustain itself in light of Greek philosophy and rationalism and science. So that was a big difference between when it came to the Muslims, the Muslim world. The Muslims didn't become atheists. They were able to take on the philosophy and the science, but maintain belief in revelation. In Europe, really, because the Bible was not able to sustain scientific inquiry. Um, Eventually, really, in the intellectual progress, Christianity really gave way. So some of the figures involved were people like Copernicus, who challenged the Catholic Church's view that the Earth is the center of the universe. And later on, Galileo, same thing. One of the interesting things about mental illness, obviously, which is my field, is that in medieval Christianity, mental illness was seen as possession by evil spirits or demons, demonic possession. And mental illness was also seen as a punishment for sins. This goes all the way back to the Bible. The Bible talks about Jesus casting out demons, from the possessed person. Um, Interestingly, the Muslims, we don't really have that tradition. We're going to come back to this in a later class, which we're going to talk more in depth about jinn possession and black magic and so on. So I don't want to dwell on it right now, but just to mention that in passing, that the Muslims in the Middle Ages, the Muslim doctors treated mental illness primarily as a physical illness, an illness of the body and the brain. And there were hospitals were set up for patients with mental illness as well as physical illness. And hospitals in the Muslim world were always free of charge for patients. They were always patronized by wealthy patrons like princes and kings, sultans, and so on. Anyhow, inshallah, we'll come back to some of that in later classes. So what is Islamic medicine? I've put Islamic medicine in inverted commas and also prophetic medicine in inverted commas, because what I'm going to suggest to you is that there's actually no such thing as Islamic medicine, and there's not really any such thing as prophetic or Tibb an-Nabawi. I'll explain why. The Muslims, they took on the Greek medicine. That's why Islamic medicine is sometimes called Unani medicine. Unani means Greek. So the Muslims literally, they took medicine from the Greeks. The Prophet, you know, he was not a doctor, he was not a medical doctor, and he did not formulate a theory or a system of medicine. There are some hadith about certain things that are cures for certain things. And obviously the Quran has got a few ayahs as well that talks about certain healing properties of certain things, which we'll come back to. But those are just isolated reports and isolated ayahs of Quran. They don't constitute a theory or a philosophy of medicine. So the Muslims, you know, if you look at where Islam expanded, first of all, Islam expanded primarily into what was the previous Persian Empire and also into the Roman Empire. And most of the Romans were Christian, and there were a lot of Jewish communities amongst them. And the Persians were fire worshippers, but they also had a lot of Christian and Jewish communities living within the Persian Empire. So the Muslims had now taken over these lands. And so those people that had been taken over by the Muslims were Jews, Christians, and Persians, fire worshippers. So they already had a tradition, you know, of medicine and so on. And most of that goes back to the Greeks. So the key figure in terms of medicine is Galen, one of the Greek doctors. Now, obviously, the Muslims did, once they had taken on the Greek medicine, once they had translated and studied the text of the Greeks, obviously the Muslims did then take that forward, and they made great advances and a lot of refinements. But essentially, at the base, it was Greek theory of medicine, which was based on the four humors of the body and things like that. And so you had people like Ibn Sina, who I already mentioned as one of the great philosophers. Philosophy was linked to science in the Middle Ages. So generally, those who were philosophers generally also tended to be scientists and doctors and so on. So Ibn Sina also had a very one of the greatest works ever written on medicine, called Al-Qanun. And much centuries later, it was translated into Latin and came into Europe. So Ibn Sina is a very, very key figure for medicine in the Middle Ages. So when we talk about prophetic medicine as well, once again, I've put in speech marks. Tibb an-Nabawi, you've probably heard of. Once again, I think it's a little bit misleading, and many Muslims don't realize that there's no such thing as prophetic medicine as such. The Prophet ﷺ didn't develop or bring us any sort of theory or system of medicine. And actually, because the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba were in such good health, they rarely fell ill. So there's not that much in the Sunnah, to be honest, of cures for different diseases and so on. And that's part of because of their very pure lifestyle and pure environment, pure diet. They were generally very healthy people. However, we will look at what the Quran and the Hadith do say. So when you come to looking at the Hadith, so there's a lot of books out there. I'm sure you've come across these books called Tibb al-Nabawi or Prophetic Medicine. Primarily, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah is one of the favorite that have been translated into English, I've noticed. What I would say is also be really careful about the hadith that are in these books. Ibn Qayyim is actually quite good. He will normally tell you how strong the narrations are. But, we have to really be careful whether some of these hadiths may be weak, and the scholars are using them as well. So the other sort of big division nowadays is sort of traditional versus allopathic, or traditional versus modern medicine. So under the traditional, you have Greek, you have what we call Islamic, which is actually based on Greek medicine. And then you have others like Chinese, Indian, and so on. Remember, the Muslims didn't just take on the Greek. The Muslims also took a lot of knowledge from the Chinese and the Indians as well. So the Muslim physicians actually synthesized many of those different traditions. But they did predominantly prefer the Greeks for whatever reason. It's important to remember that sort of modern medicine came about through the sort of 19th century in America. The very first modern medical school was opened sometime in the 19th century, funded by the Rockefeller family, the famous oil baron family. And these sort of modern medical schools were then very quick to dismiss a lot of the traditional forms of medicine, like herbal medicine and so on. And those people that practiced that type of thing were called quacks. John Rockefeller, the first of the Rockefeller oil barons, who became the most wealthy man in America, his father actually was one of these quacks that used to go around giving different types of so-called herbal medicines to people, but he was actually a con man, so he wasn't even trained in traditional herbal medicine or anything like that. So his father was notorious for going around to sort of in the American villages and things like that, and sell people all sorts of different cures, so-called cures. But he was a con man, so whether that had anything to do with Rockefeller's funding remains to be seen. And then you have something called homeopathic medicine. Now, homeopathic medicine, obviously, we often just dismiss it as a sort of scientifically it shouldn't work, because, as you probably know, the homeopathic remedies they're so diluted that there's practically none of the actual compound left, which is meant to be treating you. Yeah, so it's just basically water. However, many people will swear on homeopathy, and I know many GPs also do go into homeopathy. I came across an interesting article quite some time back in the Lancet. The Lancet ran a meta-analysis. Inshallah, I'll share it with you later. I forgot to share it. I can share it later on. The paper, it goes back now to about 2005 or something, but I'm sure there probably have been more up-to-date meta-analyses done. Um, but they were quite surprised. Obviously, they thought they would find that homeopathic remedies were just placebo. But what they actually found was that they were more effective than placebo on the meta-analysis. So that was interesting. And it was published in the Lancet. So I don't know if any of you come up with seen any more recent studies of that type. Please do feel free to let us know. Inshallah, I will share that paper after the class.
I think that there was something recently, I'll have to dig it up, about homeopathy
Yeah,
actually not being recognised, and I think quite a hardline approach against it. Something probably in the last 6 months that's been out, but inshallah, if I find it, I'll share it.
inshallah, that'll be good. Yeah. Um, okay, so as I was saying, the Greek slash Islamic medicine was based on the humoral theory, the four humors, balance of bodily humors. And the feeling was that imbalance leads to disease. That was a sort of general idea. I mean, I don't think it's worth getting bogged down. Just give me a second. I just wanted to keep an eye on the time as well. So uh, I don't think it's worth getting bogged down on the actual details of that, because obviously we wouldn't follow that sort of traditional humoral theory nowadays. Is pretty much not pretty unscientific. But I think the important thing is there to reflect upon is that the idea of imbalance. That's how the Muslim physicians, taking from the Greeks and others, they understood illness and disease as being fundamentally an imbalance within the physical body, and that leads to illness. And then the cure was always about trying to correct the imbalance. So that's probably the important principle, which I think we could probably still agree with, today. Um, Concept of tawatur. I just want to quickly mention this about tawatur or mutawatir. One of the things we have in our teaching, which is really important, is that from the Quran and the Hadith, we have different levels of reliability. Uh, as I mentioned before, some Hadith are quite weak. It doesn't mean that they're not true, but it just means that we can only be so sure, or we can only be so certain that they actually have come from the Prophet ﷺ, or that they are accurately recorded. However, then you get some hadiths which are sahih, which means that they're much, much more reliable. And especially when you get to books like Imam Muslim and Imam al-Bukhari, you can have a very, very strong degree of certainty, because particularly those two Imams, they were very, very strict in their conditions of accepting any hadith in those books. Um, but then beyond that, there's an idea which is called tawatur. This is beyond even Sahih, because a Sahih hadith, even though it may be very, very strong, uh, there's always a very, very small possibility of either error or of it not being authentic, and the scholars recognize that. But there's also a different concept, which is tawatur. To what tawatur means is, if a report has come from so many people that you basically have no possibility of doubt in the authenticity of that report. And generally, the scholars, they debated how many people does it take to make it tawatur, but on average, you could say about 10. If you had the same thing from 10 different people, and they have got no reason to believe that they could have colluded together to mislead you, you would be extremely certain of that thing. I'll give you an example. most of us have probably not been to China. Right, so I'm assuming you haven't, or think of a country that you've never visited, say something like China. If you have been to China, think of another country you've never visited. And then if I were to say to you, can you be sure that China exists? You've never been there, you've never seen it for yourself. Are you sure that there is such a place as China? Most of us would say, yes, we're 100% sure. We don't have any doubt. And that's what we call tawatur. So it's a report that has come to you from so many different places and so many different times or so many different people that you have absolutely no doubt. So the Quran reaches that level of transmission. The Quran was transmitted by so many people from every generation. And then it was written down very soon after. It was actually written down during the time of Sahaba. But it was transmitted by so many multiple people that we have no doubt in the text of the Quran. And there are some hadith which reach that level as well. But not that many, a few hundred only hadith. The reason why I'm talking about this is because I think in our context, in our day and age, especially when we're in the field of medicine or science, we mentioned how Christianity basically was destroyed by the intellectual onslaught of the enlightenment and scientific progress. For us as Muslims, the Quran has never been contradicted by modern science or any advancements in human knowledge. So it's really important for us as Muslim intellectuals or educated Muslims to recognize the difference between what is mutawatir and what is not mutawatir. Because ultimately, one day, for example, say there was some scientific developments that contradicted hadith, but that hadith is not mutawatir, even if it's sahih. For example, in Sahih al-Bukhari, we would be able to, at an intellectual level, we would be able to say, okay, fair enough, this hadith then is not correct. Alhamdulillah, I mean, for Bukhari and Muslim, as far as I know, there's not been anything that has contradicted those texts of those two particular books. But you get what I'm trying to, the point I'm trying to make is very important for us as Muslims to be aware of the distinction, so that we don't fall into problems with scientific advances and so on. We'll skip this slide, inshallah. Now, when we look at modern medicine, the important thing to remember is that modern medicine is built upon a type of philosophical worldview. Modern science and medicine portrays itself or thinks of itself as being objective. But really, there's no such thing as absolute objectivity. And anthropologists and other people within the social sciences have understood that, and they've realized that Western scientists and so on who think they're completely objective, but there are always preconceived notions and ideas deep down that we're functioning within. And it's very important for us to identify those. One of the main fields that investigate these type of things is anthropology. I did a master's in medical anthropology, so I have got some background in that area. What anthropologists in the 19th century, the field started off as a study of other cultures, what they used to call at that time exotic cultures and so on. But what's happened in the in the second half of the 20th century, the field of anthropology has turned on itself. So what they call the anthropological gaze has turned back onto Western civilization itself, which is really interesting. So a lot of anthropologists are actually, studying Western societies and Western civilization. So they can They look into a lot of these deeper sort of preconceived ideas and so on. For our purposes today, the main thing I wanted to just focus on was evolution theory. Evolution theory is pervasive in medicine, and it's pervasive in Western science generally. Um, so it's one of those things that's almost like a religious doctrine in a way. Um, it's where people scientists are just meant to accept that it's a fact. Even as Muslims, we may not realize that we're quite affected by some of these ideas. What's the idea of evolution? And there's also two related ideas within Western civilization, which are at the very, very core of Western civilization, modern Western civilization. And those two ideas are science and progress. Science and progress which is linked to evolution, because evolution is an idea of continual progress, continual improvement on nature. So what I'm going to suggest today is that the Quranic worldview is fundamentally opposed to that worldview, that things can always improve and improve and improve. And why I say that is because the Quran says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created everything in balance. Allah created the human being in a perfect form. And Allah has subjugated everything in the heaven and the earth for the human being, to serve the human being. So the Quran doesn't give us an evolutionary picture in the sense of sort of survival of the fittest, that man and other animals are in a constant struggle against their environment and against each other, and the genes that are most well suited to the conditions will survive, and there'll be this constant evolution. Some of those things, we just take those for granted because we've been brought up in the Western system. But if we look at the Quran doesn't give us that picture. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. We created man in the best stature. If man is created in the best stature, by definition, then you can't improve on the best. So there can't be any improvement. According to evolution, maybe in a million years' time, human beings will have 4 arms because 4 arms are better than 2, or whatever. You know what I'm trying to say. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, a man is created in the best stature, so you can't improve on what is already best. Also, Allah says, هُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَ لَكُم مَا فِي الْأَرْضِ جَمِيعًا. He created everything in the earth for you, for human beings. And أَلَمْ تَرَوْا أَنَّ اللَّهَ سَخَّرَ لَكُم مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَأَصْبَغَ عَلَيْكُمْ نِعْمَهُ ظَاهِرَةً وَبَاطِنَةً. And many other ayahs of the same theme, that Allah has subjugated for you everything that is in the heavens and the earth. So everything is in the service of the human being. We don't really have this idea of the human being in a constant struggle against his environment and so on and so forth. In fact, and even the idea that human beings are like, this idea of the savage, primitive human being that is the cavemen that are always fighting each other, with clubs and battering each other, and the strongest one survives. Even that is actually a certain philosophical idea, and people have challenged that idea as well. Other philosophers have challenged that idea, that actually human beings are not always fighting each other. Human beings are social. The nature of the human being is to help one another. If you look at some places, like if you go to countries like Syria, where law and order broke down, there was no government, there's no police, everything's broken down. People help each other, when there's hard times and there's scarcity of food or water. Are people all fighting and killing each other? No, they're helping each other. So there's two views, the point here is that the scientific worldview with the evolutionary basis leads scientists to believe that they can improve on nature. So this is the whole basis of science, that we're constantly improving, we're constantly getting better. We can improve on nature, and this is the thing that I would challenge from an Islamic point of view, which we've shown some ayahs of Quran. Because when we talk about nature, what we're talking about is the creation of Allah. So as an Islamic scholar, I would say what Allah has created is the best. So natural is best, and you can't beat natural products. It's interesting that the Quran also talks about shaitan, Iblis, that this is one of the ayahs, Surah An-Nisa, verse 118, 119. Here you can see. One of the things that Iblis said, shaitan said to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I shall lead them astray, and I shall command them, and they will cut off the ears of the cattle, and I shall command them, and they will change the creation of Allah. فَلَيُغَيِّرُنَّ خَلْقَ اللَّهِ. They will change the creation of Allah. So this is something that shaitan is saying to Allah, that I'm going to make human beings, I'm going to lead them astray, so that they will change the creation of Allah. So within our Islamic teaching, we do have an idea where we don't change the creation of Allah. The creation of Allah is the best creation. Even apply to the point of, men or women changing their appearance by certain things, cosmetic, what you might call plastic cosmetic surgery nowadays. I mean, it's something that's a debate between ulama. Obviously, certain things that are physical deformities, I would argue probably can be changed, but just for purely cosmetic reasons, the ulama tended in the classical text to dislike those things, because you're not then pleased with what Allah has created. Anyway, I haven't got time, unfortunately, to go into that too much right now, but we can always come back to that. This is the Tibb an-Nabawi book that I was talking about, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. You've probably seen this on Muslim bookshops and things like that. What does it say in the introduction? This is not Imam Ibn Qayyim saying this. This was an article on a prominent website that I found. Just a quote saying, "Prophetic medicine, otherwise known as Tibb an-Nabawi, is a complete code of medicine that was gifted by Allah to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ through wahi." So this is what I'm challenging here, and just to show you that this is quite widespread amongst general Muslims. So they have this, this person's making this statement, not really qualified to know what they're talking about, by saying that it's a complete code of medicine, which is not true at all. If you look at Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah's book itself, which is called Prophetic Medicine, you will see straight away, or very soon after you start reading it, you'll see that most of what he's bought is actually Unani Greek medicine. So Ibn Qayyim himself was a scholar who was a qualified doctor in the Islamic Unani medicine. But what he did was that he tried to bring in those ayahs of Quran and the Hadith and incorporate that into that wider Greek Islamic system of medicine. So that's quite an important distinction to make. Okay, so I'm going to quickly finish, inshallah, by giving three quick examples from real life to show where the sort of Western scientific model clashes with our Islamic, what should be, I argue, our Islamic understanding, and how, as Muslims, we should be aware of these things from day one. But sadly, as Muslim intellectuals and scholars, we have been lacking And we've sort of been running after Western science and medicine without really bringing the knowledge from our own tradition and trying to make a fusion. You know, we need to take what's best from Western modern medicine, and but also not to forget our own principles that are in the Quran and other places, so that we can come to a good fusion between the two systems. So example number one is this ayah of Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has talked about milk that comes from cattle. So what Allah said about the milk, He said, "Nusqikum mimma fi butunihi." We give you to drink what is in the belly of the cattle, bayna farthin wa dam, between the intestines and the blood, labanan khalisan sa'igan lisharibin, a milk which is pure and good, or pure and tasty for those who drink it. Now, obviously, what my argument here is that as Muslim scholars, when we see the Quran talking about that Allah is giving us this drink as a pure drink, we should have realized that when you pasteurize milk, you heat it up and you destroy a lot of the stuff that's in the milk. My argument is that as Muslims, we should have flagged up, in our heads, wait a minute, Allah's described this as a drink He's made for us, a pure drink. But pasteurization was meant to improve the milk by killing off bad germs and so on. However, now many people are now turning back to raw milk. Many people in the West, I'm talking about non-Muslims, have found out that raw milk is really good for you. Raw milk meaning unpasteurized milk. And what they found out is actually the pure milk doesn't have bad bacteria. This used to be because in farming, using dirty utensils and dirty buckets and things like that, that's what would transmit the infections. The milk itself is pure and it doesn't carry problematic diseases. So people like Prince Charles and other famous people have been drinking raw milk for many years now. It's been in the newspapers that it's like, an amazing, because why? The raw milk has got a lot of antibodies in there. One scientist described it as literally the white blood. It's like the white blood. It's just the red blood cells removed, but it's got all of those other white blood cells and so on. So they did some controlled studies on asthma, allergies, and this was in one of the London colleges. I think I've got the reference there, University of London it says, but it doesn't give which one it was. Anyway, you guys can look into that if you want to, but what they found was quite dramatic. Just by drinking one glass of raw milk once a week, these people, they had much less incidence of asthma and other allergies, things like eczema, immune-related conditions. So what I'm saying is, as Muslims and as scholars, we shouldn't have had to go through this process of just blindly following scientists and going into pasture. We should have thought back to the Quran and saying, actually, no, raw milk is something that Allah has created and it's going to be a perfect creation. Second example, the appendix. I don't know if any of you are surgeons. I know obviously Brother Kamran is a surgeon, but I don't think he's online right now. But I'm sure you'll know anyway, back from your medical student days and so on, that, well, actually you might know, but you might be quite younger than me, but I know when I was a medical student, they used to say the appendix is a vestigial organ, meaning it has no use. It's from the days when we used to be animals before we evolved into human beings. Um, so it was widely believed during that time when I was graduating in the 90s and so on, that the appendix had absolutely no role to play within the human being. And it was just left over from our previous evolutionary states. So what doctors used to do when they were carrying out surgery to the abdomen, often many surgeons would just snip off the appendix because they thought, well, it's useless, it's no use, and it will just be a prophylactic for appendicitis in the future. Did any of you guys come across that practice, just out of interest? Or are you too young to remember that?
No, absolutely. I think that was definitely the case.
Yeah, I don't think it's still going on because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but in more recent years, then they realized actually a lot of research started coming out that the appendix probably does have some role in the immune system. I've just got a journal article here as a reference in which was mentioning, they used to call it incidental appendicectomy. So you just snip off the appendix when you're just doing a unrelated operation. My point here is that as Muslims, once again, as Muslims and scholars and doctors with knowledge of Quran and Islamic principles, we would never have accepted that because we know that Allah created the human being in the best stature and the best form. So it just wouldn't make sense that this thing would just be a completely useless organ within the human being. And so we should not have done that in the first place, based on our principles. But this is somewhere where I think Islamic scholarship has also been very lacking, and mainly because you do have a lack of scholars that are also doctors. So this is an article, the appendix may have a purpose after all, and so on. And third and final example, infant formula milk. You probably, once again, I don't know if you guys are old enough, but certainly when I was young, there was a massive push towards formula milk rather than breast milk. I mean, nowadays you just think that was completely bizarre because it's gone completely back the other way. But at that time in the 70s and 80s, early 80s, scientists were basically saying, look, we've created this formula milk, which is better than breast milk. It's much better for the babies. It got to the point of sort of the advertising got to the point where women felt really guilty if they were not buying infant formula milk and feeding it to their babies and giving them breast milk. They actually felt guilty that they were being very negligent mothers. So it sounds bizarre to believe, but believe me, it's true. If you ask your older colleagues, GPs, who were GPs in the 70s and 80s, they'll tell you. So breastfeeding became almost like for the poor people, working class people who are backward and so on. Obviously, it was all about making money as well. Once again, my point here is that as Muslims at that time, if we had good scholars and scholars and doctors that were coming together based on our Islamic principles that Allah has created the human being and Allah's created that breast milk is going to be the best thing for the baby. We should know that from our own principles. We shouldn't have had to wait 10 to 20 years. I mean, I was one of those babies that was brought up on formula milk because my mother was told that it's best for you. So obviously, later on, it became quite established that actually breast milk is so much better for the young child. And so everything reversed back to pushing breast is best and all that stuff, right? These are some of the sort of studies at the time. Lancet 2003 talked about how so many millions of children could be saved if they were just given breast milk rather than being given all of this formula milk. The sad thing was that some of these formula milk manufacturers still, despite having all the evidence, they were still pushing the formula milk in poorer countries even though it became illegal to do so in these advanced countries. So I've given us some references for that, but I'm going to skip over that right now. Sorry, just last example quickly, butter or margarine. I'm sure you as doctors have come across this as well. At one point, everyone was saying, yeah, eat margarine. Scientists have basically improved. The natural thing was butter. This is what Allah's created, butter. But scientists have now improved. They've given you something that you don't have to get all of the bad things in butter. You can eat margarine, right? You remember those days? And so as doctors, GPs, we were all telling our patients, oh no, don't eat butter. There's too much cholesterol and all that stuff. And you better all go to margarine. So once again, in recent years, a lot of evidence started coming out that actually margarine is not so good, trans fats and all that stuff. And so everyone's now realized that actually butter was better all along. Once again, as Muslims, with those principles that we mentioned, it should have been something that we should have been able to know from our own basic principles. Okay, that's the end of the slides. Sorry, I did go on a little bit more than I wanted to, but alhamdulillah, we finished in less than an hour anyway, so hope it wasn't too much for a Wednesday evening. Happy to take any questions. Yeah, jazakumullah khairan.
Very, very interesting. So, yeah, inshallah, if anybody wants to, how would you like the questions for people to just unmute or put their hand up?
Yeah, unmute, I think it's easier, yeah. Or yeah, however you want to do it.
So if you want to ask, you just use the unmute and ask your question.
Thank you, Sheikh. I never knew all this. It's a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
I have a question that might be quite controversial. I was wondering, where do vaccines come into a natural exposure to a virus? I'm not an anti-vaccine person. I've had the COVID vaccine myself, but now that I've had all this information, it is an artificial exposure to an artificial made-up virus. So I was just wondering what your personal thoughts were on the subject.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, I mean, I hope my thing hasn't come across as too anti-medicine. Obviously, I'm not saying that at all. I think there's huge advances that have been made in Western and modern medicine, undeniable. And what my point is, though, however, we also have some principles that can help, and we need to. Unfortunately, I don't think that has been done. That work that needs to be done of bringing the Islamic principles and the Quranic worldview and incorporating that into modern medicine. That hasn't been done. But needs to be done. It's obviously like a lifetime work or whatever. But so yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that are very, very good. In terms of vaccines, it's a difficult question. I think there's so many different aspects to it. But I think generally, I'm one of those people who, none of my children were vaccinated, for example. Not because I think vaccines don't work or there's anything like that. I just, for the type of like measles, mumps and things, I just, I didn't feel, the different things. I mean, one thing is, a small baby or a small child to have a painful needle going in their arm, for me, was not a good experience for a child. Especially now, as soon as a baby's born, they want you to give a BCG injection and things like that, And also, so the whole idea of prophylactic medicine, I think there's no clear black or white answer from an Islamic point of view. Something like polio, for example, I would give my children a polio vaccination if they were going to travel to places like Pakistan or it's not now. It's much rare now. I think it's almost eliminated. But I think obviously I've had the COVID jab myself. Well, I mean, all of us probably have to really in our profession. But I also did think about it, and I think on balance, I felt it may be a bit irresponsible of me not to have it because, I've also got elderly parents, I've got other people around me. So it's not just about yourself. You have to think about society and everyone around you as well. So I think on balance, I would recommend people to have the COVID immunization myself. I don't think it's an issue of these principles that we've talked about, nature and so on, because there's an illness and we have a cure or a preventative cure for it. So I don't see it as contradicting. Islam doesn't say that there's not disease and there's not cure. Islam doesn't say that.
Thank you, Sheikh.
I think Norris has raised his hand. Norris, do you want to unmute?
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah, Sheikh Ridhwan. Just a quick query on Islamic psychology. So there's obviously a more recent growth in Islamic psychology and principles of Islamic psychology. I was just wondering whether there's a parallel with Islamic medicine. And I guess more typically this notion of Islamicization of knowledge. I don't know if you have any particular views on that.
Yeah, I have a lot of views, I'm afraid. I don't want to bore you guys all evening. Inshallah, one of the further classes will be focused on Islamic mental illness and psychology and psychotherapies and things. So we'll come back to that. But just briefly for now, I think it's a very interesting field. I am planning to write some stuff myself at some point. I think there's a lot of scope, a lot of things that has come quite fashionable recently, like mindfulness and those type of things. That we already had that within our Islamic tradition, in our Quran and our Hadith and so on. So a lot of that I think is very interesting. So inshallah we'll talk about it in more depth later on. And generally the idea of Islamicization of knowledge as well. This is, I think, what I was alluding to when I talked about Western medicine and Islamic worldview, because the Western medicine is based upon the Western worldview, and as Muslims we have a Quranic worldview, and there are differences. Once again, the field of anthropology is quite good when looking into these sort of issues. There are very, very deep fundamental differences. Some of them I feel are irreconcilable, because, for example, we believe in an akhirah, we believe in a judgment. These people don't. So that's a massive difference to many. That impacts on many different practical things. Within our practice of medicine as well, it impacts massively. If you don't believe there's an akhirah, if you don't believe there's a judgment. This life is everything. That changes a lot of how you view illness, disease, end of life decisions, and all sorts of things. So yeah, there's definitely a great need for an Islamicization of modern medical theory.
I think Shazia and then Hannah.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's not Shazia. Assalamu alaikum. It's Khurram. I'm with my wife.
Khurram, how are you?
Alhamdulillah. It's good to. Thank you very much.
You should be giving the talk. I didn't realize you were online.
No, it's actually really beneficial to hear from you. Thank you for this. Thank you for your time. Would it be a question, and then I guess I'm leading to a comment as well. Would it be okay to do that?
Yeah, of course, please. Yeah, do.
I suppose the question is that, would it be fair to say that there's a variance of opinions with regards to Islamic medicine and the definition of it, and how to reconcile it with modern medicine? So, for example, like you'd find some traditional scholars who'd be like consider themselves herbalists, and they take, for example, from the hadith of the Prophet, of Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, and she was asked how did she know about her medicine. She said that when the delegations came to the Prophet in the last 2-3 years, alayhi salam, that he would ask about their herbs and the spice and the different treatments, and that she learnt it from them. So there would be a contingent that would do so, as well as a contingent of scholars who would say that Islamic medicine is actually, that's just what's based on tajruba, just based on what we'd almost call evidence based.
Yeah.
And then and even a variance in terms of it. And would it be fair to say that there's not been a consensus opinion developed, and it's still a developing field? Or do you think it's got to a point that it has got? And I just wanted to give you an idea in terms of with regards to that. For example, Umar al-Bahrak, who's a sheikh of the 9th century, he's a muhaddith, and he's got his own risala on medicine. He's got his own treatise on medicine. And what you find very similar to Ibn Jawzi's and others, you find that he has 3 sections in it. But the first section is literally it's the humour theory, the Greek theory, just like you mentioned it. It's the Unani theory. The second aspect is his derivation of the herbs according to that. But what's really interesting is perhaps the third, which you're really indicating towards the end in terms of serving the Quran through medicine, and serving perhaps even the Shama'il of the Prophet ﷺ. Because what he talks about in that third aspect is the prophetic behavior and this companion's behavior that allowed them to ward off many illnesses and live healthy lives. Physical exercise, unprocessed foods, and so what you find then is that so he's giving his view, and so it may be easy, it may be an important point to discount the first 2, but the third, which is like this serving of the Quran and the prophetic side, alayhi salam, of medicine, what you find then is that actually that's almost the miracle of the Islamic medicine, if you were to call it Islamic medicine, in that the difficulty we have in terms of empirically proving healthy lifestyles. So there's 2 aspects to the first is question: do you think there's a point of consensus that's reached with regards to this, or different opinions? And the second point is that medicine, the most difficult thing that it has today is in terms of promoting healthy lifestyle and what it involves. And we've had the huge controversies with regards to carbs versus fats and margarines versus butter and so forth and so forth. But if you return back to the prophetic practice and the Quranic practice, that's a real benefit that we gain. Sorry.
No, thank you. That's definitely very beneficial for your comments. Jazakumullah khairan.
Just in terms of the consensus, do you think there is a consensus getting to a point, or do you think that or the variance of views are it's almost as if they're minor variances of views?
To be honest, Khurram, I personally feel no one's really dealt with it to reach a consensus. I think generally what tends to happen is what do you call it? Like a divergence, either traditional or modern medicine. You're either one camp or the other, or homeopathic or allopathic. You know what I mean? And they don't really. So I don't think anyone's tried to Islamicize Western modern medicine. I think people just tend to go into one camp or the other, which I think is totally wrong. So I don't think I think that work remains to be done.
Yeah.
And it will require people like yourself and myself that have studied medicine and also studied Islamic sciences. You're going to need, we're the sort of people that are going to have to do that type of work, that are in the position to do that. But part of doing that is we'll also have to then study traditional herbal medicines and things like that, which is a massive undertaking really for anyone.
Yeah.
So I think my point still stands that if you look at Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah and any of these other books on prophetic medicine, there's generally 2 things, like you mentioned really.
Yeah.
One is there are actual herbal, or there are actual medicines, or certain things that have certain medicinal properties. And these are very limited, I'd say. So there's things like obviously honey in the Quran we all know about. The Quran itself is a shifa in the Quran. And in the hadith, there are a few things as well, like, you know, the black seed, etc., etc. People probably know about some of them. And here I'd say, once again, you know, stick to what is sahih. It's quite important when we come to this stage of looking into the hadith. But I think they are quite limited. And then there's another aspect of sort of prophetic medicine, which is like the healing power of the Quran, ruqya, things like that. So that's the separate thing. I don't, you know, obviously we accept that. There's no doubt about that. But I don't think that comes into like a model of physical model of medicine. So I think my point, I would still maintain my point that in terms of a theory of medicine, you know,
Yeah.
generally the Muslim physicians, even those that had the prophetic knowledge, they were under the framework of the Greek model, the humoral model, but they brought in the things that they found in the Quran and the Hadith, like honey and black seed and etc., etc. They would bring those in as well. And Ibn Qayyim said that those are the most reliable because they're based on revelation, whereas all of the other herbal stuff that's come from tradition, as you said, it was empirical. You know, it was based on hundreds and hundreds of years of just experimentation, really, with different herbs and plants and things like that. He said, you know, that's come through tajruba, come through experience. But the things that we have from the Quran or the Hadith are of a higher level of certainty because obviously they've come straight from revelation. I hope that sort of answered the
Thank
question.
you. That's really helpful. Allah bless you and us.
Yeah, please come back with any further comments and things, you know.
Inshallah, listen on. Thank you.
Happy
Thank
to do make it into a discussion. I mean, these are just my thoughts as well. I'm you know,
Hey,
be open to
no,
other.
it's really valuable. Really valuable. Thank you.
Jazakumullah khair.
Wa fikum.
Jazakallah khair. I've just got a final comment and then inshallah we'll wrap up just in the interest of time. So I think this has been quite a fascinating talk, and I think it's always been really confusing. Is it sort of Greek medicine? Is it revelation? Where does the balance sit? And an element of quackery and abuse of people. So I think it's factoring in all of those things and the amana that we have as medical practitioners. For those, you know, most people in the group know that I have an interest in lifestyle medicine. So I went off and I did some training in functional medicine, which is basically, you know, very close to our Islamic teachings, really. And the more you look at it, it's very close to how the Prophet lived his life. And I think sometimes we get really caught up on the nitty gritty of certain things. I think completely in terms of, you know, what Allah subhanahu has given us. And in terms of butter, it contains not just omega-3, if it's from an organic source.